I'm hungry.
Do you want food?
Please, my daughter is hungry. The woman knelt in the snow outside Murphy's Diner on Christmas Eve, a 6-year-old girl shivering beside her. Jeremy Watson, ex-detective driving home from his delivery shift, stopped his truck. Not because of charity, because something didn't add up. Her posture, the child's expensive shoes, designer coat beneath the dirt. This wasn't ordinary homelessness. This was something else entirely. Subscribe now so you don't miss the most shocking truth about this Christmas Eve that will change everything. Drop a comment telling me what you think happened to this woman. Turn on notifications right now because you're about to find out how one detective's instincts uncover the biggest fraud of the decade. Let me take you back to when Caroline Green's life was perfect. 2 months earlier, Caroline Green stood in the executive tower of her company, 40 stories above downtown Chicago, and looked at the city lights scattered below her like diamonds someone had dropped. At 35, she'd built something remarkable, something from nothing, something that mattered. Emerald Design Systems. She'd started it in her tiny apartment 10 years ago with her business partner Marcus Price. Just the two of them. Coffee-fueled nights, arguing over algorithms, dreaming of a company that could revolutionize how small businesses approached branding and digital presence. Those early days had been magical in the way only struggle can be. They'd eaten ramen for 6 months straight, had maxed out credit cards to buy servers, had worked through the nights, her head on her desk while code scrolled across the screen, Marcus pacing with his phone, both of them driven by something larger than themselves. The company had been born from her vision, a platform that made complex design systems accessible to companies that couldn't afford $100,000 consultants. She'd coded most of the first version herself, had spent nights redesigning interfaces until they were perfect, had tested the platform with real clients, refining it obsessively. Every feature represented hundreds of hours of her vision and determination. Marcus had been her friend, her first hire, her best advisor, the one she trusted completely. She'd brought him in when she couldn't manage the company alone, when the client base had grown beyond what she could handle. He'd been brilliant with operations, with managing the team, with understanding the business side of what she'd created. She'd trusted him with passwords, with authorization codes, with the deepest parts of her company's architecture. She'd made him COO, had given him a percentage of the company, had told herself that they'd be partners forever. The company had grown beyond their wildest imaginings. 300 employees across 5 offices in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Austin, and Miami. Clients from Fortune 500 companies to startups. Annual revenue of $62 million and growing. The platform had been featured in Forbes, in Wired, in every major tech publication. And Caroline had been the face of it all, the CEO, the innovator, the woman who'd appeared on magazine covers and TED stages. Her first TED Talk had gone viral, watched by millions who saw in her story the dream of every entrepreneur, starting with nothing and building something extraordinary. She had a 6-year-old daughter named Sophie, an ex-husband who'd wanted nothing to do with fatherhood, so Caroline had done it alone, managing one of the most demanding companies in America while raising a brilliant, curious child who loved building things just like her mother. Sophie had spent afternoons in Caroline's office, learning to code before kindergarten, understanding design in an intuitive way that made Caroline's colleagues gasp. The little girl had inherited her mother's creativity and drive, but also her mother's belief that the world could be better if you were willing to build it yourself. Life was not perfect, nothing ever was, but it was absolutely everything she'd worked for. Every sacrifice had felt worth it. The missed dates, the cancelled vacations, the nights she'd put Sophie to bed by video call from the office. It all felt like it was building towards something permanent, something unshakable, something that would matter long after she was gone. Then came the audit. October 15th. A routine check by their external accounting firm, except it wasn't routine at all, because inside of 6 hours their accountants discovered what would become the nightmare Caroline could never have anticipated. $52 million missing, moved in fractional transfers over 3 years, hidden in shell companies, laundered through vendor accounts that didn't exist, sophisticated enough to require a full forensic investigation to untangle, and the signature on every document, every authorization, every transfer, Caroline's, except she'd never signed them. The forensic accountant had presented the evidence with the precision of someone trained in the art of identifying fraud. The shell companies had been created with sophisticated methodology. The transfers had been disguised across multiple financial institutions. The money had been moved through foreign accounts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore, places where tracking became exponentially more difficult. The account numbers were tied to Caroline's identity, her email addresses, her digital signatures on the wire authorizations. It was perfect. It was, in fact, too perfect. The kind of framing that only someone who understood both finance and corporate systems could have orchestrated. The moment the accountants told her, she understood. Marcus. It had to be Marcus. She'd trusted him with everything. Access to her signature, authorization codes, her absolute faith. He'd been present during the development of the financial systems. He'd attended the meetings with the accountants. He'd helped implement the security protocols that were supposed to prevent this kind of fraud. "Call the police," she'd said immediately. "This is fraud. This is—" That's when Marcus walked into her office. He was calm, composed, almost smiling, and he held a file in his hands like a magic trick nobody would see coming. He'd clearly been waiting for this moment, had orchestrated it perfectly. He closed the door behind him and moved to the chair across from her desk, with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring victory. "Before you say anything," he'd said, "before you make any calls, I want you to read this." Inside were emails, fabricated ones obviously, but they looked real. Sophisticated forgeries suggesting that Caroline had authorized the transfers, had initiated the scheme, had been skimming money from the company for years. The emails had her correct email signature, the way she actually signed off. They referenced projects and meetings she'd actually attended. They were interspersed between real emails from her account, making them blend seamlessly into her actual communication history. There were falsified bank statements in her name, offshore accounts in her personal passport information, documentation showing wire authorizations with her digital signature. Everything arranged perfectly to make her look like the thief. He'd even fabricated emails between her and the shell company owners, crude imitations of her voice that were just sophisticated enough to fool someone scanning quickly. "The board has already been notified," Marcus had said calmly. "Our lawyers have these documents. I've already gone to them with everything. I've been cooperating with them for 3 weeks now. They're very sympathetic to my position, by the way." Poor Marcus, the loyal second-in-command, finally discovering his partner's betrayal. Caroline's world had stopped. "You'll want to hire a lawyer immediately," Marcus had continued, his voice almost gentle. "Though I should tell you, our current legal team is very confident in the evidence against you. The criminal charges for wire fraud and embezzlement should be filed within the week. The SEC is already involved. Expect federal charges as well. But this is evidence of your fraud, not, it's evidence of my foresight," he'd interrupted. "I've documented your poor business practices for years, your reckless decisions, your emotional management style. The board will agree that you're unstable, impulsive. Not the visionary founder everyone thinks. The real victim here is me, poor Marcus, finally standing up to the toxic CEO who's been stealing from under his nose." He'd walked to the door, then turned back. "Oh, and you're fired, effective immediately. Security is waiting to escort you from the building. Your bank accounts are frozen pending the investigation. The house in Evanston, of course, is corporate property. You have 48 hours to remove your personal possessions before it reverts to the company. Try not to make this difficult, for Sophie's sake." He'd closed the door behind him. The next 72 hours were a blur of phone calls and lawyer meetings, and a reality that kept refusing to make sense, because by then the narrative had already taken root. Marcus had submitted his evidence to the board, to the authorities, to the press. Emerald Design Systems held a press conference. They announced that their CEO had perpetrated one of the largest corporate frauds in recent history. They expressed their devastation, their commitment to justice, their plans to restructure under Marcus Price's leadership. Marcus appeared on the news that evening, devastated and noble. "I never wanted to believe it," he'd said, looking into the camera with perfect heartbreak. "Caroline was my friend, but the evidence is overwhelming. I had to do the right thing, no matter how painful. The media destroyed her, because destroyed was the only word for it. Caroline Green went from celebrated entrepreneur to corporate criminal in 72 hours. Articles appeared questioning her entire career. Colleagues who'd praised her publicly issued statements expressing their shock and disappointment. Clients cancelled contracts. Investors demanded their money back. But worse than the professional devastation was what came with it. The legal system. The criminal charges filed by federal prosecutors looking to make an example of someone. The courtroom battles with lawyers who cost more than she had remaining in assets. The frozen accounts, the seized property, the entire world of capital that had sustained her life, suddenly locked away. She couldn't even pay her lawyers after the first month. By October 30th, Caroline had lost everything. No house, no company, no reputation, no career, no access to the bank accounts that had built her life. Sophie's expensive private school, gone. The beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Park, seized by federal authorities. Her retirement accounts, frozen. Every asset, every investment, every future she'd planned, gone. She had the clothes on her back. A car Marcus still allowed her to drive because he'd been magnanimous. A storage unit with personal possessions. And a daughter who kept asking, "Mommy, when can I go home?" Home. As if home was a place you could go back to. She'd reached out to her parents, swallowing every ounce of pride. They'd already heard the news, the national news, the fraud of the decade. Their daughter, the criminal. "We can't," her mother had said quietly. "We have our retirement, our community. If we're seen helping you, it could damage your father's position at the country club. You understand?" Caroline had understood. Money makes people honest. Loss makes people cruel. Her parents, who'd always loved her, couldn't afford to be associated with her anymore. She'd tried friends, old college roommates, people she'd helped, invested in, believed in. One by one, they'd made excuses. They didn't know what to say. They didn't want to get involved in legal proceedings. They had their own families to think about. By November, Caroline had been living in her car. She'd taken a hotel room for 2 weeks, bleeding through her savings. But the money ran out so quickly. Without access to her accounts, without credit that could be used, her lines of credit were all frozen too. Without a job, who would hire the national poster child for corporate fraud? She had only what cash remained from before the seizure, approximately $8,000, which meant 1 month in even the cheapest hotel in Chicago. Then she was on the streets. The first week was shock. The second week was desperation. The third week was acceptance that this was her life now. She found a homeless shelter, though the horror of those places took something out of her that never healed. The smells, the violence, the sheer degradation of sleeping in a room full of 60 other people, all of them broken in different ways. Sophie had nightmares. Her daughter, who'd been afraid of monsters under the bed, was now learning exactly how real the world's darkness could be. Caroline had moved them out after 4 nights. Better to sleep in the car, to preserve Sophie's fragile childhood a little longer. She'd driven out to the edges of the city, to parking lots where other people lived in vehicles, where an unspoken community of the desperate tried to maintain some kind of normalcy. She worked occasional shifts at McDonald's. The restaurant manager was kind, didn't ask too many questions. $15 an hour, cash payment at the end of each shift. But work required finding childcare, and daycare cost money she didn't have. The math never worked. She'd panhandled, stood outside grocery stores with a cardboard sign. The first time, she'd almost died from shame. The second time, the shame had been replaced by a different feeling, the numb acceptance of someone out of options. By the 5th time, she'd gotten good at it. The right angle, the right expression, the right story to tell. Just trying to feed my daughter, that's all. Just enough for food. Most people walked by. Some gave $1 or $2. A few pretended she was invisible. She'd applied for government assistance, been rejected because the fraud charges meant she had outstanding financial obligations, been told she could appeal, but appeals took time, and time was the one resource she couldn't afford to spend. She'd tried to contact lawyers, fought back against the charges. But without money for a real defense, she got a public defender who was overworked and overwhelmed. The case moved through the system with the speed of bureaucracy, slow, inevitable, toward conviction. Caroline had even gone back to Marcus's office, to the building that used to be hers, just to understand. She'd waited in the lobby for 2 hours, asking for Marcus at the desk, being told repeatedly that he was unavailable. Finally, he'd come down, looking annoyed more than anything else. When she'd asked him to explain, to tell her why he'd done this to her, he'd simply smiled. The smile of someone who'd won. The smile of someone who understood that the game was rigged, and he'd rigged it. "Because I could," he'd said. "Because you were successful, and I was tired of being second. Because you were too trusting to see it coming, because the world rewards the bold and the ruthless, and I'm both." Then he'd gestured to security and had them remove her. They'd been almost gentle about it, more embarrassed than rough, but the message was clear. He'd won. She was gone, and there was nothing she could do about it. As security escorted her out, she'd looked back and seen him taking the elevator back up to her office. The office that used to be hers, the company that used to be hers, the life that used to be hers. All of it belonged to him now. That was 3 weeks ago. Now it was December 13th. Christmas Eve was 5 days away. And Caroline Green, who'd once stood 40 stories above Chicago and felt like she could do anything, was kneeling in an alley, asking strangers for money to feed her daughter. Jeremy Watson's apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, older, the kind of place that rented for $800 a month because nobody else wanted it. But it was clean, and it was his, and it had a window where Mia could see the street below and feel like she wasn't completely trapped. His ex-wife had made sure he understood exactly how trapped he was. Jeremy was 39 years old. 9 years ago, he'd been a detective with the Chicago Police Department. A good one, a decorated one, a man with a 20-year career ahead of him. He'd specialized in fraud cases, had an uncanny ability to see patterns others missed, had solved over 80 cases before his 35th birthday. His colleagues called him obsessive. They meant it as a compliment. He could look at a financial statement and see the lie embedded in it, could follow a money trail through a dozen accounts and find where it led, had received commendations from the mayor, had been asked to train new detectives in investigative technique. At 34, he'd received the police department's highest honor for solving the Donovan embezzlement case, a case that had seemed impossible until Jeremy had found the pattern in the data. $20 million recovered. 3 executives imprisoned. Then he'd married Diana. She'd been beautiful, funny. She'd laughed at his jokes and said she wanted the same things he wanted: a family, stability, a life built on trust. She'd understood what it meant to be married to a detective, or so he'd thought. She'd listened to his stories about cases, about patterns, about the satisfaction of finding truth buried under layers of deception. They'd been married 3 years when their daughter Mia was born. Jeremy had never felt anything like it. That fierce love, that absolute commitment to protecting her, that understanding that his life was no longer his own. He'd held his newborn daughter and felt something shift in his chest, a rewiring of his entire existence around this small, perfect human. Suddenly, the work didn't matter as much. The cases seemed less urgent. All he wanted was to come home, to hold Mia, to be present for the ordinary moments that became the memories of a life. Diana had felt differently. He'd started noticing it gradually, the way she'd look at him with contempt when she thought he wasn't watching, a curling of her lip when he came home late from work, the way she'd mock him for caring too much about Mia, calling him controlling when he wanted to know about her day, her feelings, her development. The way her phone would buzz and she'd smile in a way she never smiled at him, a smile full of warmth and anticipation that made something in his stomach twist. He was a detective. He'd connected the dots with the methodical precision that had made him good at his job. The late nights out with vague excuses about girls' night, the texts she'd delete when she saw him coming, the phone disappearing from the counter when his car pulled into the driveway, the way she'd suddenly care about her appearance again, buying new clothes, taking extra time in the bathroom, talking about her skincare routine like it mattered. The cologne that smelled like someone else, not the drugstore brand she'd bought him for years, but something expensive and woody and utterly foreign. He'd asked her about the affair. Directly, a detective's straightforward approach to uncovering the truth. She'd laughed. Actually laughed. "You're being paranoid," she'd said, rolling her eyes at him. "That's your detective brain, always seeing crimes where there aren't any." But there was a crime, and it was being committed against him. He'd followed her one evening, knowing he shouldn't, knowing that this crossed a line from detecting to stalking. But he had to know. Sat across the street from a hotel downtown where she'd disappeared for 2 hours, his chest burning as he watched the entrance. Watched her come out laughing with a man he didn't recognize, a man in an expensive suit with a satisfied expression. Had taken photos on his phone, evidence, the way a good detective does, his hands shaking as he clicked. When he'd confronted her with the photos, she'd done something he wasn't prepared for. She'd gotten angry. Not defensive, angry, and she'd said things that rewired his understanding of everything. The words had been like a weapon, designed to cut at the places where he was most vulnerable. "You're obsessed with work," she'd said coldly. "You come home exhausted. You smell like poverty and criminal filth. I have a daughter who barely knows her father because you're too busy playing cop to be a real man. So yes, I found someone else, someone who actually wants me, someone who isn't broken." "We can work on this," Jeremy had said. "I don't want to work on this," she'd interrupted. "I want out." The divorce had been brutal. It had been the kind of divorce where one person wanted retribution more than resolution. Diana had been smart, had saved up money, had her affair partner help, had hired a lawyer who was as ruthless as she was. She'd claimed he was psychologically unstable, that his obsessive detective work meant he was emotionally unavailable, that his control issues made him unsuitable for primary custody. She'd painted a picture of Jeremy as a controlling, paranoid man with psychological issues that made him dangerous to their daughter's well-being. She'd hired a lawyer named Richard Castellano, a man who specialized in custody battles. Richard was aggressive, ruthless, willing to say anything if it would help his client. He'd drafted motions questioning Jeremy's mental fitness. Had obtained records from his police psychiatrist about a bout of depression Jeremy had experienced 5 years earlier, a perfectly normal response to a difficult case, but Richard had framed it as evidence of untreated mental illness. He'd fought back, had gotten his own lawyer, a public defender overworked and underfunded, stretched across a dozen other cases. But the story had taken root in the judge's mind. The judge had read Richard's carefully crafted narrative, Jeremy Watson as a man whose obsession with work had created an emotionally barren home, Jeremy as someone who'd tracked his wife like a criminal, Jeremy as a detective so consumed by his need to solve crimes that he couldn't maintain a healthy marriage. He had PTSD, she'd argued. He had trust issues. He was too obsessive. He needed to work on himself before he should be around a child. The judge nodded along as if this made perfect sense. The judge had awarded Diana primary custody. Jeremy had sat in the courtroom, watching his life be defined by someone who'd never met him, based on the narrative constructed by people who wanted him destroyed. Jeremy had lost his daughter. Not completely. He'd gotten every other weekend. 2 weeks in summer. He'd paid child support that left him barely able to survive. But for 5 days a week, Mia lived with Diana. And then one day, Diana had decided to make it worse. She'd called his department, complained that his work as a detective was triggering his PTSD, that he'd come home from crime scenes and yell at Mia, that he'd told his daughter he didn't trust people, that he was passing his psychological damage onto their child. She'd spoken to his captain directly, had brought documents with her, had orchestrated a careful campaign of character assassination that looked like the concerned statements of a worried mother. She'd requested that his custody be examined again. The department had required psychological evaluation. Jeremy had gone to the sessions, had sat across from a psychologist named Dr. Catherine Woods, who'd been cold and clinical, asking pointed questions designed to make him look unstable. Had he experienced anxiety? Yes, like anyone in law enforcement. Did he have trouble sleeping? Sometimes because his mind worked through cases at night. Did he have trust issues? Yes, because his wife had cheated on him, and his job had shown him how easily people lied. Each honest answer had been twisted in the final report, reframed as evidence of pathology rather than reasonable responses to difficult circumstances. Jeremy had tried to explain that he was fine, that he was coping, that he loved his daughter more than anything and would never harm her. The psychologist had concluded, "The subject exhibits signs of untreated PTSD and shows concerning patterns of hypervigilance and paranoia that could negatively impact his ability to raise a child." That was it. One evaluation, one medical opinion written by a psychologist who'd spent 6 hours with him total. And suddenly, Jeremy wasn't just losing custody battles. He was losing respect. His fellow detectives looked at him differently, their eyes carrying a new wariness. The assumption spread through the department like a contagion. Jeremy was broken. Jeremy was unstable. Jeremy was the guy you don't want working crime scenes because he's projecting his trauma. Younger detectives who'd once asked him for advice stopped coming around. The partnership that had been offered for a major case was quietly given to someone else. He'd stuck it out for another year. But every day was agony. Every day at the station he felt the looks, the whispers. He'd walk into the break room and conversations would stop. He'd join an investigation and the team would exchange glances, as if his presence might contaminate the case. The evaluation had poisoned everything. One psychologist's clinical assessment had become the narrative that defined him. Jeremy Watson, formerly respected detective. Jeremy Watson, now broken. Jeremy Watson, too unstable to be trusted around evidence, too paranoid to be reliable, too damaged to be leadership material. It got worse when Diana filed for additional custody restrictions. She'd sent letters to his sergeant, to the captain, to the precinct psychologist. She'd painted a picture of a man spiraling, a man who couldn't separate his work from his home life, A man who projected his trauma onto his innocent daughter. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter anymore. The narrative was set. At 38 years old, Jeremy had resigned from the Chicago Police Department. He'd walked into the captain's office on a Tuesday morning and handed over his badge, his service weapon, his identification card, all of it. His hands had been shaking as he set them on the desk. The captain hadn't asked him to stay, hadn't reminded him of his accomplishments or the cases he'd solved, had just nodded and accepted the resignation with a relieved expression that Jeremy would never forget. The captain had seemed relieved. That was the worst part. The captain, a man who'd praised his work for 9 years, who'd written recommendation letters and commendations, was relieved to see him go. The narrative had become powerful enough that even a man who'd known Jeremy for years believed it. Believed that Jeremy Watson, decorated detective, had somehow become a liability. Jeremy had left behind a pension he could have fought for, seniority, respect, everything he'd built his adult life around. He'd walked out of that precinct at 3 in the afternoon and never went back. Now he drove for a delivery company, 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. He drove for an owner named Carl, who didn't care about background checks or employment history or the gaps in employment. Carl paid cash at the end of every shift, $15 an hour, which was roughly minimum wage in Illinois, but delivered in crumpled bills and never reported to anyone. Carl had hired Jeremy with a single question: "Can you deliver packages on time?" Jeremy had said yes, and that was the entire interview. Jeremy didn't have to explain the gaps, didn't have to talk about Diana or the evaluation or the way his entire career had imploded, didn't have to watch people's expressions shift from respect to pity to suspicion. Carl didn't care. Carl just cared that the packages got delivered on time and the truck didn't get damaged. There was something almost liberating about working for someone who had such simple expectations. No one at the delivery company cared about his past. No one whispered about his mental health. No one looked at him like he was broken. It was degrading in its own way, but it was better than the alternative, which was nothing, better than the shame of the precinct, better than the looks, better than the slow erosion of everything he'd built. He made enough to afford the small apartment, to pay child support, to afford the bus fare to visit Mia on his scheduled weekends, to keep his daughter alive and cared for. Everything else was sacrifice. He hadn't eaten a meal at a restaurant in 4 years, hadn't bought himself anything new since 2021, hadn't had anyone in his apartment, hadn't tried to date, hadn't tried to build a life, because his life was Mia, and everything else was just logistics. Mia was 8 now, smart, funny. She had Jeremy's eyes and Diana's dark hair, and she was growing up with the understanding that her father was somehow broken, somehow less than, somehow the reason she couldn't have a normal family. Jeremy tried to counteract that, tried to show her that love was reliable, that her father was stable, that broken things could hold up. But he was fighting against an entire system designed to convince her otherwise. He was exhausted. The delivery job meant he wasn't sleeping, meant he was driving through the city at all hours, meant he was in no condition to think, to plan, to be anything other than a machine that moved packages from point A to point B. And that was when he saw them in the alley on Christmas Eve. The woman kneeling beside a dumpster, the small child crying, the impossible wrongness of it all, the details that didn't fit. Jeremy had the truck, and 20 minutes before he needed to head home. He had no money to spare. He had no capacity to help anyone. But he had 9 years of experience reading people, and his every instinct screamed that this wasn't what it looked like. He pulled into the parking lot anyway. He parked the truck and walked into Murphy's Diner, ordered coffee and a turkey sandwich he couldn't afford, and from the window booth he watched the woman with the child in the alley. She wasn't panhandling the way he'd seen on the streets. There was no performative element, no hardened edge. She was just kneeling, holding her daughter, speaking so quietly he couldn't hear the words. The desperation in her posture was real, but it was the desperation of someone new to desperation, someone still shocked by the precipice they'd fallen over. Jeremy pulled out his phone and pulled up the news app. He searched Chicago Fraud CEO, and there she was. Caroline Green, 35, CEO of Emerald Design Systems, wanted for embezzlement of $52 million. Currently considered a flight risk. Federal charges pending. Except the woman in the alley didn't look like a flight risk. She looked like someone who'd surrendered to gravity completely. He read through the articles, the press conferences, the statements from her partner, Marcus Price, expressing shock and disappointment. The narrative was clear. Caroline Green had committed fraud. She was guilty. She was criminal. But Jeremy had learned something in 9 years as a detective. Narratives could be lies. He paid for the coffee and sandwich and took them to the alley. "My name is Jeremy," he said quietly. "I work nearby. I thought you might be hungry." The woman looked up at him with suspicion, the kind of suspicion someone who'd lived on the streets learns immediately. Her hand moved protectively in front of her daughter, a gesture of both protection and threat. If he moved wrong, she'd shield Sophie. She was thin. Her face had the sharp angles of someone who'd been underfed for weeks. But her eyes were still intelligent, still sharp, still capable of assessing threat. They tracked him carefully as he approached, reading him the way he was reading her. "I don't need charity," she said, but her voice was hollow. It was the voice of someone who'd asked for charity and been refused too many times. Someone who'd reached the point where pride and hunger were in constant negotiation. "I know. This is just food. There are no strings." He set the sandwich on the ground beside them, not too close, respecting the space she'd claimed in the alley. The child, a little girl no more than 6, watched the sandwich like it was a miracle, like it might disappear if she wasn't careful. Caroline put her hand on her daughter's shoulder protectively, her eyes still locked on Jeremy, still assessing, still uncertain. "Why?" Caroline asked. It was the question of someone who'd learned that nothing in this world was free, someone who was trying to calculate what the cost might be. Jeremy could have lied, could have said something kind about Christmas spirit, about the holidays bringing out generosity. Instead, he told the truth. "Because I'm a very good observer of people," he said. "I used to be a detective, and everything about you tells me that this isn't your normal situation, which means either you're running from something or something's been done to you. Either way, you probably need help." For the first time, he saw something shift in Caroline's expression, a crack in the wall she'd built. Not hope. She was past that. But a recognition that maybe she'd been right to be confused, that maybe the world wasn't entirely divided into predators and survivors. "I don't have anything to give you in return," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything." She looked at her daughter, at the sandwich, and Jeremy saw the calculation happening in her mind. Pride versus hunger, dignity versus survival. Sophie made the decision for her. The 6-year-old reached out and took the sandwich, and Caroline didn't stop her. They ate in the alley while Jeremy sat beside them, pretending to be on his phone, actually watching their reflections in the diner window behind them. The child ate with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been going without, her small hands almost frantic with the need to consume before the food disappeared. Caroline watched her daughter eat with an expression of such tenderness mixed with devastation that Jeremy had to look away. Eating more slowly, Caroline seemed to be relearning the mechanics of it, as if hunger had become an abstract concept rather than a physical sensation. She was rationing, Jeremy realized, making the sandwich last as long as possible. How long had it been since she'd had a full meal? When they finished, Jeremy stood up. "There's a shelter about 2 miles from here," he said. "It's better than the one downtown. The manager is kind. They have a children's wing. It's warm tonight. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve, so they'll have a meal. Real food, not just the basics." "How do you know all this?" Caroline asked. There was no suspicion in her voice anymore, just exhaustion, and the faint glimmer of desperate hope that maybe this man wasn't lying. Maybe some people in the world were actually kind, because he'd been terrified of ending up on the streets himself, because he'd researched shelter systems obsessively, the way his detective mind researched everything, keeping a mental map of resources in case he ever fell that far. Because he was always one catastrophe away from joining her in that alley, and knowing this kept him moving, kept him surviving, kept him fighting. Because every time he thought about Mia living without him, every time he imagined losing his daughter completely, he understood exactly what this woman was facing. "I just do," he said. "You can stay there tonight. Tomorrow you can figure out what comes next." He gave her $40 from his pocket. Money he couldn't afford. Money that was supposed to be for gas to get through the rest of the week. Money that meant he'd have to make different deliveries tomorrow, find ways to conserve fuel. But he gave it to her anyway, because some things mattered more than survival logistics. She looked at the money like it was a test, like if she took it, she was accepting something that couldn't be undone. Like this kindness might be a trap. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because I think you need help," he said. "And because Christmas Eve is a good day to do something that costs you something." He left before she could thank him or ask more questions. He drove through the city with his stomach growling, rationing his gas, thinking about the woman in the alley and the way she'd looked at her daughter. He thought about Mia, about the Christmas Eve his daughter would spend with Diana, about how much he had and how much he'd lost, about the fragile margin between stability and catastrophe, and he thought about the narrative, about how easily someone could be destroyed if the story was convincing enough, if the evidence was fabricated well enough, if the people you trusted turned out to be monsters. He thought about that until his shift ended at midnight. Then he drove home and waited for the next day. The shelter took Caroline and Sophie in without questions. They were given a room, small, clean, with 2 cots and a window. For the first time in weeks, Caroline felt something like relief. Not safety. You didn't feel safe anymore when you'd been this far down, but relief that her daughter would sleep warm, that Sophie would eat tomorrow, that for one night the machinery of survival could pause. She lay in the darkness, listening to her daughter breathing, listening to the sounds of the shelter, listening to the voices of other broken people trying to sleep, and she thought about the man, Jeremy, the stranger who'd given her money and food and kindness without condition. There were no people like that anymore. There were only people who wanted something from you, or people who'd already taken everything. Unless Jeremy was after something she hadn't understood, unless there was an angle, unless this was a test of some kind. But her daughter was sleeping peacefully, warm and safe, for the first time in weeks, and Caroline was too exhausted to keep up her guard. She fell asleep thinking about Detective's eyes, thinking about instinct, thinking about whether it was possible for someone to care about someone else without it being transactional. The next morning, Christmas Eve morning, Jeremy couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her child. He ran through the names and faces in his head, the way his detective brain still worked even though he was no longer a detective. Caroline Green, CEO, 35 years old, charged with embezzlement. Primary evidence provided by her business partner, the woman in the alley. The mother who'd asked for help to feed her daughter. What if the evidence was wrong? What if she'd been set up? Jeremy had been set up before, in a sense. Diana had constructed a narrative about him that was convincing enough to destroy his career. What was to stop someone else from doing the same? If his ex-wife could weaponize a single psychological evaluation to shatter his professional reputation, what could a business partner with access to financial systems accomplish? He pulled up everything he could find about Emerald Design Systems, the company structure, the financial reports, the board composition, the articles about Marcus Price taking over. His hands moved across the keyboard with a precision that surprised him. It had been so long since he'd done investigative work, and his fingers remembered it anyway. Marcus Price was celebrating. The news coverage made him out to be noble for exposing his partner's crimes. He was being floated as the new face of Emerald Design Systems. He was doing media appearances, talking about rebuilding trust, about accountability in corporate culture. He'd even been approached by business schools to teach courses on corporate integrity. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating, but if he'd perpetrated the fraud and framed Caroline for it, he'd have to hide the evidence carefully. He'd have to make it look like Caroline had stolen the money. He'd have to either 1. Fabricate evidence that implicated her. 2. Manipulate actual financial records to make it look like she'd authorized transfers. 3. Have insider help at the accounting firm, or with the board Jeremy didn't have access to bank records or financial data. He wasn't a detective anymore. He didn't have the authority or the resources. He had no official standing, no warrant, no legal right to investigate. But he had curiosity. He had the detective's mind that wouldn't stop even when the detective had. It was like a muscle that had atrophied but wasn't dead. Touch it, and it came back to life. He pulled up Marcus Price's LinkedIn profile, started reading his history with the obsessive attention that had once made him a great detective. 5 years at Emerald Design Systems as second-in-command. Before that, various marketing jobs at 3 different companies. Interesting that he'd moved around so much. Before that, a degree from Northwestern with a major in business and a minor in computer science, data systems. Jeremy's pulse quickened. That wasn't an accident. Someone with access to computer systems could do things, could manipulate digital signatures, could access accounts they shouldn't have access to, could fabricate evidence that looked real because they understood the underlying code. He pulled up Marcus Price's educational history, certifications. There, a course from 2019 titled Advanced Financial Data Management. Another one, Digital Forensics and Cybersecurity. The man had been training himself, building skills, preparing for something. Jeremy spent the entire morning going through public information, financial reports, SEC filings, news articles, board minutes from years past. He wasn't finding smoking gun evidence, but he was finding inconsistencies. The kind of inconsistencies that only someone who'd spent 9 years learning to see them would notice. The financial transfers started 3 years ago, the news said. But 3 years ago, Marcus had just been promoted to COO. 3 years ago, he would have been building influence, learning systems, setting up access, building the architecture of his own fraud, while everyone applauded his loyalty. Jeremy wrote down dates, connections, timeline. He drew lines connecting events that seemed unrelated until you saw them from the right angle. The kind of investigative work he wasn't supposed to be doing anymore because he was broken and unstable and a man with psychological problems. But it felt good to think like a detective again. It felt like remembering who he'd been before the narrative had destroyed him. By noon, he needed to pick up Mia for their weekend. He showered, changed, and tried to clear his mind of Caroline Green and Marcus Price, and the narrative that didn't add up. Mia came running out of her mother's house when he pulled up. She was 8 years old and still enthusiastic about spending time with her father, which broke his heart because he knew that wouldn't last forever. Soon enough, she'd absorb Diana's contempt and understand that Jeremy was the disappointing one. "Hi, Dad," she said, throwing her arms around him. He held her tight and felt the world make sense for the first time in days. "Merry Christmas Eve," he said. They spent the afternoon doing the things they always did. They went to a movie. They got cheap pizza. They went back to his apartment and he helped her make cookies with the $3 baking mix and the spice cabinet's worth of supplies. They listened to Christmas music. They talked about the presents she'd gotten at her mother's house and the presents he had hidden for her. At 7 p.m. there was a knock on his door. Jeremy wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, he found Caroline Green standing in his hallway. She looked slightly better, still thin, still worn. But someone had helped her. Someone had given her a shower, maybe. Someone at the shelter had given her a change of clothes. Her hair was damp and brushed. She was holding a small wrapped package. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said quietly. "Someone at the shelter told me you drove for the delivery company, gave me your address. I didn't know if you wanted—" "Come in," Jeremy said. "Please." She stepped inside and saw Mia immediately. His daughter was sitting at the kitchen table with flour in her hair and Christmas cookies spread out before her. Mia stared at the woman, curious, the way children are curious before they learn to be suspicious. "Who's this?" Mia asked. Jeremy didn't know what to say. "I'm Caroline," the woman said, "and this is for you, though it's not much." She held out the wrapped package. Mia looked at Jeremy for permission. He nodded. Mia opened the package. Inside was a small wooden box with intricate carvings. It was beautiful, professional, the kind of thing that belonged in a museum, not in the hands of an 8-year-old. "Did you make this?" Mia asked. "A long time ago," Caroline said, "when I had a workshop. It's been sitting in storage. I thought maybe you'd like it." Mia opened the box. Inside was a music box mechanism. Caroline wound it up and music played, a soft, delicate melody that filled the small apartment. "It's beautiful," Mia said, and she meant it. And Jeremy realized something. The woman in the alley. The CEO framed for embezzlement. The mother who'd been broken by the world. She was still creating things, still finding ways to give to others, still human. "Thank you," Jeremy said. "Would you like tea? We just finished cookies." Caroline stayed for an hour. She and Mia talked about building things and design. She told stories about creating products. She asked questions about what Mia enjoyed, and Jeremy watched his daughter come alive in a way she hadn't in years, talking to someone who actually listened, who understood creation, who asked her to explain her thoughts. When Caroline left, Mia hugged her, and something inside Jeremy shifted. He needed to help her, not because it was Christmas, not because it was kind, but because if Caroline was innocent, if she'd been framed the way he suspected she had, then she was another person destroyed by a narrative, another person whose life had been systematically dismantled by someone else's lies. He knew how that felt. After Mia fell asleep, Jeremy pulled out his laptop again. He dove deeper, more research, more timeline building, more pattern recognition. This time he looked for information about the embezzlement itself, the court documents, the charges, the evidence against Caroline. And he found something, a small thing, easy to miss. But his detective brain caught it. The forensic accountant's report listed the shell companies the money had been funneled through. 3 of them, created between 2021 and 2022. But one of them was created on a date when Caroline had been on vacation, out of the country, in France with Sophie, documented, confirmed by passport stamps. How could she have created a shell company from France? She couldn't. Marcus could have, though. Marcus, who had access to all her accounts, all her credentials, all her authorization codes, because he was the trusted partner. Jeremy printed out the forensic report, made notes, drew lines connecting dates and transfers and corporate filings, and then he did what any good detective does when he's found something that might matter. He went to see the woman, The next morning, Christmas Day, Jeremy borrowed his neighbor's car and drove to the shelter. He found Caroline in the dining hall, eating a Christmas meal with Sophie and other residents. She looked up when she saw him, surprise crossing her face. "I need to talk to you about the charges against you," Jeremy said quietly. "I think I might have found something that proves you didn't do it." Caroline went very still. "How?" she asked. "Because I used to be a detective," Jeremy said, "and I know how to read evidence." They sat in a small room the shelter provided for visitors. Jeremy laid out his findings. The timeline, the impossibility of Caroline being in France while creating a shell company, the pattern of access that pointed to Marcus, not Caroline. "This won't be enough on its own," Jeremy said. "We'd need bank records, financial documents, access to the actual server logs from the company. But if I could find that, if we could prove that Marcus Price had the technical capability to fabricate your signature on these documents, if we could show you didn't have access when the transfers happened—" "Why are you doing this?" Caroline interrupted. "You don't know me. You have nothing to gain." Jeremy thought about that, about the real answer. "Because my ex-wife told everyone I was broken," he said quietly. "Because she told them I was psychologically unstable and paranoid, and people believed her, even though she was lying, even though she was the one who'd wronged me. And I survived it barely. I have a daughter who's being raised to believe her father is broken, and I know that if someone believes the lie hard enough, it becomes true. It becomes the story everyone tells, and it becomes your life." He looked at Caroline. "You don't deserve to lose your life to a lie," he said, "and I'm going to help you get it back." The investigation took 3 weeks. Jeremy couldn't do much from the outside. He didn't have police authority anymore. He didn't have access to financial records or company servers. He didn't have a badge or the ability to compel anyone to cooperate with him. But he had a mind that knew how to think like a criminal, and he knew how to ask the right questions. He contacted the forensic accountant privately, explained what he'd found, explained that he'd been a detective and knew how to read financial reports, explained that the timeline didn't add up, explained that one of the shell companies had been created from the Cayman Islands on a date when Caroline had been in France. The accountant had been skeptical at first. The case was closed, the narrative accepted. Why would he want to reopen it? But Jeremy had learned how to be persuasive, how to show people the pattern they'd missed, enough that the accountant agreed to look more carefully at the timeline, to re-examine the access logs, to see if something had been missed in the original investigation. He researched Marcus Price's educational background with the thoroughness of a detective running a complete background check. Found not just the data security certification, but multiple courses in computer security, advanced database management, and most tellingly, a course in detecting and preventing financial fraud. The man had been training himself in both committing fraud and, presumably, avoiding detection, a certification that would have given him knowledge about how to manipulate digital signatures and accounting software, knowledge about how to leave fingerprints that looked like they belonged to someone else. He gathered everything into a file, printing it out, making notes in the margins, drawing connections the way he used to before he'd lost his official authority. The apartment walls were covered with his investigation, a detective's war room created in the spaces of his small living room. Then he did something he shouldn't have done. He called a contact at the Chicago Police Department, not in an official capacity, just as an old friend, a detective named Sarah Chen, who'd respected his work before the divorce. They'd worked together on 3 major cases. She'd always believed in him, even after the evaluation. They'd grabbed coffee a few times, talking about old cases, avoiding talking about the present. "I think I've got something," he told her, "about the Emerald design fraud. I think the CEO was framed." Sarah had been hesitant at first. Why would she stick her neck out for a disgraced detective? Why would she reopen a case that had already been solved to the satisfaction of prosecutors and the public? But Jeremy was good. He'd always been good at this. He knew how to lay out evidence in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And when he explained the timeline, the shell companies, the certifications Marcus had earned, the access logs, the digital signatures, Sarah had gone quiet. "I can't promise anything," Sarah had said carefully, "but I'll pass this along to the federal task force. They're handling the case." It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Enough to make someone in authority question the narrative that had already solidified. Enough to get the evidence reviewed by someone with the skills to actually understand it. Someone with the authority to act. Jeremy had hung up the phone and sat in his apartment, surrounded by his investigation, hoping he hadn't just wasted 3 weeks on something that nobody would care about. The waiting was the hardest part. 3 weeks of not knowing. 3 weeks of hoping. 3 weeks of helping Caroline rebuild her daughter's shattered sense of security, while carrying the weight of knowing that their only chance at redemption rested on whether the federal prosecutors took Sarah's tip seriously. 3 weeks of living in 2 realities simultaneously, the present, where he helped Caroline with daily survival, and the possible future, where her name was cleared. Caroline had nightmares during those weeks. Jeremy would hear her from Thomas's couch in the living room, crying out in her sleep, calling Sophie's name, trapped in the nightmares of losing her daughter again. Once, he'd gotten up and found her in the kitchen at 3 a.m, staring at nothing, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold the cup of water she'd been trying to drink. He'd taken the cup from her gently and led her to the couch, sat with her while she cried, let her talk about her fears, that nobody would believe them, that the evidence wouldn't matter, that even if it did, it would take years to clear her name, and Sophie would grow up thinking her mother was a thief. The damage was already being done. Every day Sophie spent knowing her mother was wanted for fraud was another day the narrative took root. Jeremy had held her hand and promised her something he had no right to promise. "We're going to fix this. I don't know how yet, but we're going to fix it." In the meantime, Jeremy was helping Caroline in smaller ways. He let her and Sophie stay in his apartment while he slept on a friend's couch. Thomas's couch, technically, an old friend who'd stuck by him through the divorce and didn't ask questions. It was a sacrifice, but it felt right. These 2 broken people needed a space where they could breathe, where they could remember what normalcy felt like, where Sophie could sleep without fear and Caroline could let her vigilance down for a few hours. He helped Sophie with schoolwork. The little girl had fallen months behind due to the instability of living on the streets. Reading levels dropped, math comprehension shattered, but she was eager to learn again, hungry for knowledge, desperate to catch up and prove to herself that she hadn't been destroyed by the streets. Jeremy worked through math problems and reading assignments with her every evening, his detective's patience serving him well as he explained concepts 6 times, 10 times, until Sophie's face lit up with understanding. She would sit at his kitchen table with her pencil gripped carefully, still learning the right pressure, still learning that pencils didn't need to be held with the desperation of someone afraid to lose them, and asking question after question, determined to understand everything. Some nights, he'd catch her watching him work, as if she was memorizing what safety looked like. He listened to Caroline talk about her company, about Marcus, about the machinery of betrayal that had been built with such deliberate precision. She would sit in his small living room at night after the girls were asleep and talk about the early days of Emerald Design Systems, the vision they'd had when they were young and believed they could change the world, the difference they'd wanted to make, the TED Talks and the magazine covers, and the moment when she'd first understood that someone close to her was stealing everything. the moment when trust had become the vulnerability that destroyed her. "He learned from me," she said one night, her voice raw. "That's the worst part. I taught him everything: how to manage the company, how to understand our clients, how to navigate the business world, how to access the systems, how to move money through channels most people didn't even know existed. And he used all of it against me." Jeremy understood that particular pain in the depths of his soul. Diana had learned how to make people doubt him. She'd used his own vulnerabilities, his dedication to his work, his tendency to obsess over cases, his need to understand the truth, and weaponized them against him. She'd studied what made him passionate and made it seem like pathology. "People who betray you are always people who got close enough to understand you," Jeremy had said. "That's what makes betrayal hurt more than anything else. It comes from someone who knows exactly where you're vulnerable, someone who understands your strengths and can twist them into weaknesses, someone who can use your own obsession with truth against you." Caroline had cried that night, not the quiet tears of exhaustion, but the deep, racking sobs of someone finally acknowledging the full extent of her loss. The friendship lost, the company lost, the years of trust weaponized. Jeremy had held her while she grieved, had held her while her body shook with the force of it, had held her while she processed the reality that someone she'd mentored, invested in, trusted like a brother had deliberately constructed a prison of lies to trap her inside, and he was falling in love with her. Not in the idealized way that comes from distance and fantasy, but in the slow, painful way that comes from sitting across from someone in their darkest moment and choosing to see the light in them anyway. From watching her fight to hold her daughter's hand while the world told her she'd failed. From seeing her maintain her dignity when she had every reason to surrender. From recognizing in her the same refusal to accept a false narrative that had defined him as broken. It happened gradually, in moments. The way she looked at the world even after it had torn her apart. The way she made things. In his spare time she'd built a bookshelf from scrap wood. The way she played with Sophie and his daughter. The way she'd rebuilt hope from nothing. On January 10th, Sarah Chen called him back. "The federal prosecutors are reopening the investigation," she said. "Based on what you found, they got a warrant to examine Marcus Price's personal and work computers. And Jeremy, you were right. There's evidence of data manipulation, evidence that he fabricated Caroline's digital signatures, evidence that he accessed her email account. He covered his tracks pretty well, but the cybercrime unit found fingerprints in the code." Jeremy felt something in his chest release, something he'd been holding tight for weeks. "What happens now?" he asked. "They're building a new case against Marcus Price. Federal charges for fraud, forgery and computer crimes. They're going to recommend that the charges against Caroline be dropped." Jeremy hung up the phone and went to tell Caroline. She was in the small kitchen of his apartment, making dinner. Sophie was at the table with Mia, doing homework together. Caroline looked up when he came in and he didn't say anything. He just pulled her into an embrace and held her while she realized. "It's done," he said. "You're cleared." She started crying, not the quiet tears of exhaustion, but the full, racking sobs of someone who'd been holding everything together and finally felt like they could break. Jeremy held her while her daughter ran over, asking what was wrong, if everything was okay, if they were happy tears or sad tears. "Happy tears," Caroline told Sophie, "the best kind." The federal case against Marcus Price moved quickly after that. The evidence was overwhelming once the authorities knew where to look. The cybercrime unit had dug into his personal computers and found copies of the original files. Digital signatures he'd created using Caroline's biometric data. Emails he'd drafted in her voice, the linguistic patterns tracked and analyzed. scripts he'd written to access her email account and plant evidence. Marcus had been too confident, too sure that his framing of Caroline would hold, too convinced that no one would think to look twice at the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. He'd left digital fingerprints all over the embezzlement, evidence of his access to Caroline's accounts going back 3 years, documents showing his fabrication of her signatures, the code he'd written to do it, the tests he'd run before implementing it. Server logs from Emerald Design Systems proving he'd been the one authorizing transfers, moving money through the shell companies he'd created. Evidence of his visits to the Cayman Islands, his meetings with people who specialized in money laundering, his careful planning stretched across months and years. The press covered the case reversal extensively. The narrative flipped so completely that it was almost like watching a reverse film of his destruction. Articles appeared questioning everything they'd written before. Journalists who'd accepted the original story without scrutiny began investigating how they'd been manipulated. Caroline Green, once the poster child for corporate fraud, was suddenly the victim of one of the most elaborate white-collar crimes ever prosecuted. Marcus Price, once the noble whistleblower, was revealed as the actual thief. The man who'd positioned himself as the hero who'd finally exposed his corrupt partner was arrested at his apartment, charged with federal crimes that would put him away for decades. The narrative flipped. The news apologized for their coverage. Some newspapers issued full retractions. Caroline's name was cleared not just legally, but in the court of public opinion. The vindication was almost as powerful as the destruction had been. Her reputation was restored in the public eye, though she knew that some people would always believe the original story. That's how narratives worked. Some people would hold on to the lie because it was the first story they'd believed, because admitting they'd been wrong meant admitting something about themselves they didn't want to face. That's how powerful narratives were. But she didn't care about those people. She cared about her daughter. She cared about watching Sophie's face when the news reported that her mother had been cleared, that her mother wasn't a criminal after all. She cared about rebuilding something from the ashes, not the company, not the reputation, but a life, a real life, not the performance of one, and she cared about Jeremy Watson, the man who'd believed her when no one else did, the man who'd risked his limited authority to investigate someone no one else thought to question, the man who'd seen her not as a headline or a narrative or a cautionary tale, but as a human being who'd been destroyed by a lie. On February 14th, Jeremy took her to dinner. Nothing fancy. They couldn't afford fancy. But it was at a restaurant where they could sit across from each other and feel like people who'd survived something instead of people being destroyed by it. "I love you," Jeremy said. "I know you didn't want to hear that yet, but I'm done waiting to say it. I love you, and I want to build something with you, something real." Caroline reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for a while. But I was afraid of bringing more disaster into your life. I was afraid I was still toxic. I was afraid—" "I know," Jeremy interrupted. "Me too. But I think we're not disasters anymore. I think we're just people who've been through something terrible and survived it. People who know how to appreciate what we have." They kissed across the table at the cheap restaurant, and it felt like redemption. By spring, things had changed significantly. The U.S. federal court sided with Caroline completely. Not only were the charges dropped, but her seized assets were unfrozen. The house was returned to her, though she decided to sell it. Too many memories of who she used to be. The company was returned to her, though she chose to restructure it, to keep only the parts that had meaning. Marcus Price was convicted on federal charges of fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and computer crimes. He received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. His reputation was destroyed. The man who'd carefully built a narrative of victimhood found himself the subject of a different narrative, that of the con artist who'd almost gotten away with it. Caroline rebuilt Emerald Design Systems with different values. She kept fewer employees, but paid them better. She took on clients who'd been victimized by fraud, offering pro bono work to help them recover their cases. She created a foundation to help people like her, people who'd lost everything to white-collar crime. And she built a life with Jeremy. They moved into a new apartment together, smaller than the old house, but bigger than the one Jeremy had been surviving in. Mia and Sophie shared a room and became sisters in all the ways that mattered. Diana, after an ugly custody battle where Jeremy's reputation was finally exonerated, agreed to a 50-50 custody arrangement. Jeremy got his detective's license back. Not to work for the police department, but as a private investigator. He specialized in fraud cases where narratives had been constructed to destroy someone, cases where evidence had been fabricated. He was good at it, because he knew how it felt to be destroyed by a lie. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, Jeremy stood in a kitchen decorated with lights and garland. Mia and Sophie were building gingerbread houses on the counter. Caroline was beside him, stirring cider on the stove. "Do you remember?" she asked. "1 year ago. You and Sophie in an alley," Jeremy said. "You asking for food. You saving me," she said, "giving me hope when I had none left." Jeremy pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just believed in you until you could believe in yourself again." On New Year's Eve, Jeremy proposed. Not with an expensive ring, they didn't care about that, but with a ring he'd found, vintage and simple, that Caroline put on and loved because it was his. They married the following June, in a small ceremony with Sarah Chen there, and Mia and Sophie as flower girl and ring bearer, in a garden where love had been rebuilt from the ground up. Caroline used her wealth to build her foundation larger, the Fraud Victims Alliance, a place where people who'd been destroyed by white-collar crime could get support, legal help, and hope. She worked with law enforcement to improve how they investigated fraud cases, how they distinguished between fabricated evidence and real evidence, how they protected innocent people before the narrative became too powerful to overcome. Jeremy continued his work as a private investigator. He and Sarah Chen partnered sometimes, investigating cases that the police department took an interest in. He became known in Chicago as the detective who solved the cases that nobody else could. Mia and Sophie grew up together as sisters. They grew up understanding that sometimes the world tears things apart, but sometimes, if you're careful and smart and willing to fight, you can put them back together. They grew up knowing that their parents had survived catastrophe together. That love was a choice, not a given. That trust had to be earned. On Christmas Eve, 5 years after that first meeting in the alley, Jeremy stood in their home, a real home now, something they'd chosen together, and looked at his family. Caroline was helping Sophie with her science project. Mia was on the couch doing homework. Outside, snow was falling, and the city glowed with Christmas lights. This wasn't the life Jeremy would have chosen if he could see the future. He would have chosen the version where Diana had loved him, where his marriage had worked, where he'd stayed a detective and been respected, where he never had to taste the bitterness of betrayal or feel the sting of being called broken by people who were supposed to support him. But this was the life he had, a life where he'd been broken and had been built back up by the mere act of believing in someone else. A life where a stranger in an alley had become the love of his life. A life where two families had become one. And it was infinitely better than the life he'd imagined. Because in that other timeline, the one where Diana had stayed faithful, where the system had believed him instead of her, where he'd continued as a detective, he would never have met Caroline. He would never have known that it was possible to build something real from ruins. He would never have learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from being vindicated by the system, but from finding someone who needed your help and having the strength to give it anyway. Jeremy watched Mia explain something to Caroline about an equation she didn't understand. The little girl sat between them, her head moving back and forth as the two adults worked through the problem together. This was his real victory. Not proving Diana wrong, not being exonerated by the courts, not rebuilding his reputation, but creating this moment, this family. And it was better than any life he could have imagined. Because sometimes the best things come from surviving the worst things. Sometimes justice comes to those who deserve it. Sometimes love finds you in the most unlikely places, at the moment you need it most. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to rebuild your entire world with someone who understands exactly what you've lost. On Christmas morning, Caroline woke up beside Jeremy. Through the window, the city was white with fresh snow. In the other room, she could hear Mia and Sophie already awake, already excited about opening presents. She kissed Jeremy's shoulder and slipped out of bed. Downstairs, she found the girls making hot chocolate, arguing about whether marshmallows should be added before or after, laughing at each other. This was what she'd lost, the ability to have a normal life, the simple joy of Christmas morning with her daughter. This was what the fraud had taken, and this was what she'd gotten back. Not just her life, but a better one. Not just her daughter, but a whole family. She thought about Marcus sometimes, in prison, serving time. Had he thought about what he'd lost? About the life he'd destroyed? Did he regret it? It didn't matter. Caroline didn't think about him much anymore. He lived in the past, and she was building the future. She pulled the girls close and breathed in the smell of hot chocolate and Christmas morning. Jeremy came downstairs and put his arms around all three of them. "Merry Christmas," he said. And Caroline felt something that had taken her years to feel again. Gratitude, not just for surviving, but for thriving. Not just for losing everything and getting some of it back, but for being given something completely new. That was the real gift of surviving catastrophe. It wasn't just recovery, it was transformation. She was no longer the woman who'd been framed and destroyed. She was the woman who'd fought back and won. She was the woman Jeremy loved. She was Sophie's mother. She was Mia's mother, in all the ways that mattered. She was whole again, different than before, but whole. As the four of them sat together opening presents on Christmas morning, Caroline understood that the fraud, the betrayal, the destruction, it had all happened to make this possible. To strip away who she'd been so she could become who she was meant to be. To destroy her old life so she could build a new one. To show her that some people were worth trusting, that love was real, that justice existed if you were brave enough to fight for it. Jeremy held her hand while they watched the girls open their presents, and she knew he understood too. They'd both been destroyed. They'd both been betrayed. They'd both been brought to their lowest points, and from those lowest points, they'd built something beautiful. Years would pass. Mia would graduate from high school, would head to college, would become a detective like her father, but a different kind of detective. One who believed in people, who looked for the truth beneath the narrative, who understood that systems could be designed to hurt you, but could also be fixed. Sophie would go into design like her mother, but she'd focus on building systems that protected people from fraud, that made it harder for predators like Marcus Price to operate. Caroline's Fraud Victims Alliance would grow. It would help thousands of people who'd been destroyed by white-collar crime. It would partner with law enforcement agencies across the country. It would become the gold standard for how to protect innocent people before the narrative became too powerful to overcome. Jeremy's private investigation firm would become the most trusted in Chicago. The cases he solved, the fraudsters he exposed, the innocent people he helped clear their names. It all stemmed from that Christmas Eve when he saw a woman and her daughter in an alley and recognized that something didn't add up. By the time Mia and Sophie were teenagers, Jeremy and Caroline had helped solve over 100 fraud cases, worked with law enforcement, testified in court, exposed criminals who'd thought they were too clever to get caught. Every single case carried with it the lesson Jeremy had learned on Christmas Eve. The most convincing lies are the ones told by people we trust. Jeremy would give talks at the Chicago Police Academy, seminars on narrative fallacy. How the best lies aren't the most elaborate ones. They're the ones that fit the worldview of the person being deceived. His ex-wife's narrative about him as a broken, unstable man had worked because it fit a story that other people wanted to believe. It was more convenient to believe that Jeremy was the problem than to believe that Diana was the villain. Similarly, Marcus Price's narrative about Caroline being the thief had worked because it fit what people expected of a successful CEO. Ambitious, ruthless, willing to cut corners. The public wanted to believe she was guilty because believing it meant the system worked, meant that fraudsters got caught and punished. The truth was far messier. The system didn't always work. Good people got destroyed. Bad people succeeded. Justice wasn't automatic, but it was possible. And that's what Jeremy lived for now, making it possible, fighting for the people who'd fallen through the cracks, who'd been destroyed by elaborate lies, who'd been written off by a system that preferred the comfortable narrative to the complicated truth. Caroline, meanwhile, had become an advocate for fraud victims. She'd testified before Congress about the gaps in how financial crimes were investigated, the way that initial narratives took root and became impossible to dislodge, the way that frozen assets and criminal charges could destroy someone's life long before guilt was ever proven. She'd written a book about her experience, From the Alley, How a Christmas Eve Mercy Saved My Life. It became a bestseller, not because it was a sensational exposé, but because it was honest about what it meant to lose everything, what it meant to be homeless, what it meant to have the world believe you were a criminal when you weren't. Most importantly, her book was honest about what it meant to be saved. Not by the system, not by the law, but by a stranger's kindness, by someone who was willing to believe her when nobody else would. That book changed things, brought awareness to the problem of false accusation and fraud, spawned legislative action, resulted in new protocols for investigating white-collar crime. It all started in an alley on Christmas Eve, because that was what they'd learned, that narratives could be powerful, that lies, if told convincingly enough, could become truth, that the systems designed to protect people could also be weaponized against them, but also that one person, one detective with a good heart and a sharp mind, could make a difference. That evidence could be found. That truth could triumph. That justice was possible. Not guaranteed, not automatic, but possible. If you were willing to fight for it. If you were willing to believe in someone when the rest of the world had already condemned them. If you were willing to see the person beneath the narrative. Jeremy and Caroline would live that truth every day. They'd live it in how they treated each other, in how they raised Mia and Sophie, in how they helped others who'd been destroyed by lies. They'd live it in Christmas mornings, surrounded by hot chocolate and presents, and daughters who'd learned that love was worth fighting for. They'd live it in quiet moments when Jeremy would pull Caroline close, and she'd feel his heartbeat against her cheek, and they'd both remember the people they used to be, the detective who'd been called broken, the CEO who'd been called a thief, the two people who'd found each other in the darkest moment and had built something that was unbreakable. On Christmas Eve, every year they would remember. They would remember the alley, the cold, the desperation, the moment when a stranger had seen someone not as a criminal or a vagrant, but as a human being who'd survived something devastating. They would remember the investigation, the evidence, the moment when truth had finally triumphed over narrative. They would remember the journey from that moment to this one, from broken to whole, from destroyed to rebuilt, from alone to family. And they would be grateful, not for the suffering, never for that, but grateful that the suffering had led them to each other. That catastrophe had taught them what mattered, that losing everything had shown them what was worth having. On Christmas Eve, 5 years after the first meeting in the alley, Jeremy would wrap his arms around Caroline and whisper in her ear, "I'd do it all again, everything, all of it. If it meant I'd find you." And Caroline would turn to face him, her eyes wet with tears, and say, "I know, because I'd do it again too, just to be here, just to have this, just to have you." And in that moment, in that quiet room filled with Christmas lights and the sound of their daughters laughing in the background, they would both understand the deepest truth, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things, that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what truly matters, that sometimes a stranger's kindness can change your entire life, and that sometimes, if you're very, very lucky, the person who saves you becomes the person you spend the rest of your life loving. That was their story, a story of fraud and betrayal, a story of broken people who became whole, a story of justice and love, a story that began in an alley on Christmas Eve and led to a lifetime of happiness. And it was the most beautiful story that had ever been told. Years later, when Mia was in college studying criminology, she would give a presentation about narrative fallacy in criminal investigations. She would tell the story of her parents, how her father had been labeled broken and unstable by a system that preferred the convenient narrative to the complicated truth, how her mother had been labeled a criminal and destroyed by evidence that was fabricated so carefully that the entire system believed it. She would talk about the Christmas Eve when a stranger had believed in her mother, when a broken man had refused to accept the narrative, when two people who'd been destroyed by lies had chosen to fight for truth. The presentation would receive a standing ovation. Her professor would ask her to expand it into a thesis. That thesis would win awards, and by the time Mia graduated, she would have already been recruited by the FBI's white-collar crime task force. They wanted her skills, her instincts, her understanding that narratives could be lies. "Your father taught you to look for the truth beneath the story," her FBI recruiter would tell her. "My mother taught me that justice was possible," Mia would reply. "My father just taught me that it was worth fighting for." Sophie, meanwhile, would become a leading voice in cybersecurity. She'd develop systems that made it harder to fabricate digital signatures, made it harder to manipulate financial records. Her patents would be licensed by banks and government agencies around the world. When asked about her motivation, she would always say the same thing. "My mother lost everything to digital fraud. I decided to make sure it couldn't happen to anyone else." Caroline and Jeremy would travel together to conferences and seminars. They would share their story, would talk about false accusation and fraud, and the way the system could be weaponized by anyone smart enough to understand how narratives worked. They would help change laws, would testify before legislative committees, would become experts that prosecutors and defense attorneys both called. But the real legacy would be smaller than that. It would be in the thousands of people they helped, the ones who'd been framed, the ones who'd been destroyed by elaborate lies, the ones who'd lost everything and thought they could never get it back. Jeremy would work with a young man named David, an accountant who'd been framed by his business partner for embezzlement. David would have lost custody of his kids, lost his career, lost everything. But Jeremy and Caroline would believe him, would investigate, would find the truth, and David's kids would get their father back. They would work with a woman named Maria, an immigrant whose employer had manipulated her visa situation and framed her for theft to avoid paying her final wages. Maria would have faced deportation, But Jeremy and Caroline would fight for her, would expose the employer's lies, would help her get green card status. Maria would eventually become a citizen, would become a lawyer specializing in immigrant worker rights, would help thousands of people who'd been exploited like she was. Every case added to their legacy. Every person they helped became part of the story. Every life they saved because they believed the truth mattered more than the narrative. On Christmas Eve, every year, they would remember the alley, the cold, the desperation, the moment when everything changed because one man decided to believe in someone the world had condemned, and they would work harder, fight longer, never give up on the people who'd been destroyed by lies. Because that's what Christmas Eve meant to them. Not the holiday, not the commercialism, but the moment when a stranger's kindness could change everything. The moment when one person's refusal to believe the comfortable lie could save another person's life. The moment when justice became possible. And that was the gift Jeremy and Caroline gave to the world. Not just their own redemption, but the understanding that redemption was possible, that justice could be served, that broken people could heal, that lying narratives could be challenged and overturned. They gave their daughters the gift of knowing that their parents were fighters, that even when the world said it was over, when the system had decided your fate, when everything and everyone had abandoned you, it was still possible to fight back. That was the real legacy. Not the cases solved, or the laws changed, or the foundation established, but the message: you are not defined by the lies told about you. You are not trapped by the narrative that the powerful create. You are not broken beyond repair. There is always someone who will believe in you when nobody else does. There is always hope on Christmas Eve.